time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
William had been walking into Windsor expecting a difficult meeting, not a confrontation that would change the temperature of the entire royal household. Then he saw one familiar figure standing outside Charles's private office, an advisor closely connected to Harry. The prince stopped mid-stride. Within moments, the scheduled Windsor meeting was halted. Aides were dismissed from the corridor, and one question suddenly mattered more than everything on the agenda. Why was Harry's advisor there? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not move for several seconds. His eyes stayed fixed on the man near the office door before he turned to an aide and asked, quietly, "Who cleared him?" The controlled tone carried more danger than anger. This Windsor meeting had been arranged as a restricted discussion about family coordination, future responsibilities, and decisions that could shape the monarchy. An approved attendance list existed for one reason. Everyone inside that room was supposed to be known before the conversation began. Harry's advisor was not on it. The prince stepped toward the meeting room entrance, reached for the handle, then stopped. Behind the door, Charles was still inside his private office, waiting for the session to begin. William looked back toward the advisor and lowered his hand. "Nobody goes in," he told the staff. The order landed instantly. Chairs remained empty. Folders stayed closed. What should have been a controlled royal discussion became a test of trust between father and son. A senior courtier checked the briefing sheet once, then again. His expression changed. The advisor's name appeared nowhere. A briefing sheet is the list and summary prepared for a royal meeting, showing who is expected and what subjects are due to be discussed. That missing name mattered because the corridor outside the king's private office was not an ordinary waiting area. Access there meant someone had cleared the visitor through staff and security. William expected the man to be escorted away. He was not. Instead, the advisor remained exactly where he was, calm enough to suggest that his presence had been planned. The future king felt the meaning sharpen. Someone with authority had wanted Harry's representative close to Charles before the meeting began, yet nobody had warned him. The prince finally turned toward his father's door and asked for a private explanation before anyone entered the meeting room. Charles remained on the other side, and the corridor seemed to hold its breath. The meeting had been stopped, but the real shock was not that Harry's advisor had reached the corridor. It was discovering whose permission had brought him there. To understand why one man standing outside one office could stop an entire royal meeting, the personal stakes had to be understood. William saw danger, where Charles still saw the possibility of family repair. Harry remained physically absent, yet his presence dominated the corridor through the advisor waiting outside the king's door. This was no ordinary scheduling dispute. It reopened years of mistrust between a father hoping to preserve something and two sons who no longer trusted the same people. William remained standing when he finally entered Charles's private office. The chair opposite the desk had been pulled out for him, but he refused it. As heir, his responsibility was no longer limited to supporting his father. He was being prepared for the future of the crown, and that meant protecting official decisions from becoming entangled with private family disputes. The heir is the person next in line to inherit the throne, carrying growing responsibilities long before becoming monarch. For him, that distinction mattered, because every blurred boundary around Harry risked becoming a future institutional problem. Charles turned a silver pen slowly between his fingers. He looked tired rather than angry. Harry was still his son, no matter how painful the relationship had become, and the king had never fully accepted the idea that every private channel between them should be closed. He believed there had to remain some narrow path where father and son could speak, without every contact becoming a public battle. Yet that hope now placed him directly against William's demand for transparency. The prince felt personally deceived. Windsor had been presented as restricted, controlled, and carefully planned. Seeing Harry's advisor outside the office made him wonder whether the meeting had been something different all along. Charles insisted nothing official had been compromised, but William's expression hardened because the breach, to him, was already emotional. He had walked into Windsor expecting honesty from his father, and instead discovered a man whose presence had been concealed from him. A quiet admission made the tension worse. One aide confirmed in a documented internal account that the advisor had contacted Charles's office several times during the previous week. But those approaches had not gone through the normal family liaison channel used to handle sensitive communication. Harry himself was never expected at Windsor. That meant his representative had arrived for a purpose of his own, to deliver something, request something, or negotiate something on the Duke's behalf. William finally looked directly at his father and asked the question that changed the conversation. When did this start? Charles stopped turning the pen. The silence lasted just long enough to make the answer feel dangerous. Neither man could resolve the corridor crisis without confronting the moment that had created it, and that moment had begun weeks before Windsor. The advisor had not simply appeared at Windsor without history. Weeks earlier, during a private evening at Clarence House, Charles had agreed to something William had never been told about. No cameras were present. No formal family meeting was announced. But that conversation became the hidden trigger behind everything that followed. By the time William saw the same advisor outside the private office at Windsor, a quiet line of communication had already been opened and deliberately kept away from him. Charles had grown increasingly uneasy about the way every exchange with Harry seemed to pass through lawyers, public statements, staff, and competing household interests before it ever reached him. Clarence House, one of the king's official residences and a place often used for private meetings, offered something the wider royal machine could not: a controlled setting where a personal conversation might remain personal. He began to believe that one informal channel could prevent another family rupture from exploding into public view. 3 weeks before Windsor, the king quietly received Harry's advisor there for 40 minutes. The discussion was narrow but dangerous. They spoke about reopening direct father-son communication without involving the wider household, without formal announcements, and without immediately bringing William's office into the process. The advisor argued that too many people had become part of a relationship that once belonged only to a father and his son. Charles listened. More importantly, he agreed to test the idea. The king felt cautiously hopeful when the meeting ended, but hope quickly turned into concealment. He knew William would question the arrangement, and he feared the prince might shut it down before it had any chance to work. So he chose silence. That decision mattered because the future king was already carrying greater responsibility for family strategy and royal stability. By keeping him outside the conversation, Charles was not merely withholding information, he was gambling with trust. The advisor left Clarence House with permission to contact one senior member of Charles's office directly, bypassing the normal route used for Sussex-related correspondence. That quiet approval gave the arrangement real weight. It also created the path that eventually led straight to Windsor. Charles stood alone after the visitor had gone and reread a short, handwritten note from the conversation. He folded it once, held it for a moment, then placed it inside a desk drawer instead of sending it to William. In that small act, the king protected the channel he hoped might repair one relationship while unknowingly weakening another. William would later understand that Harry's advisor was never the deepest wound. The real injury was discovering that his father had decided secrecy was easier than trusting him. At Windsor, that concealed decision was no longer hidden, and William was about to demand an answer directly from the man who had made it. The door closed behind William, leaving father and son without the protection of secretaries, schedules, or ceremony. There was no shouting at first. That made the exchange more dangerous. William asked one direct question. Had Charles personally approved Harry's advisor being brought into Windsor? The king did not answer immediately. That hesitation told the prince almost everything. What followed was not simply an argument about access. It was an argument over trust, authority, Harry, and the future shape of the monarchy. William placed both hands on the back of the unused chair and held his father's gaze. "You knew he was here." Charles looked down before answering, "I knew he was coming." The admission landed hard. The monarch explained that he had approved a private conversation with the advisor, but insisted the man was never supposed to enter the formal Windsor meeting. A formal royal meeting is an official working session where attendance, subjects, and responsibilities are fixed in advance. To the king, that boundary still mattered. To his son, the secrecy had already crossed it. The prince drew a sharper line. He told Charles that speaking privately to Harry's representative was one thing. Allowing that same figure into a restricted working environment linked to royal business was something else entirely. William's anger began to change. Beneath it was hurt. If this had happened once without warning, he asked, what would stop future decisions involving Harry from being made the same way? The future king was no longer questioning one visitor. He was questioning whether he could trust the process around his own father. Charles pushed back, but the force in his voice carried exhaustion more than authority. Every attempt to speak to Harry, he said, somehow became a constitutional argument, once the wider household became involved. By constitutional, he meant anything touching the rules, roles, and public responsibilities surrounding the crown. The king was trying to speak as a father, yet every private move seemed to become an institutional crisis. His frustration was real, but so was William's refusal to accept hidden arrangements. The tension sharpened when the prince asked whether the advisor had brought a proposal. Charles paused, then admitted that he had. He refused to discuss it, while the man remained outside. Only after staff were told to move the advisor away from the corridor did the king explain the terms. Harry wanted a private meeting with his father, without several senior aides present, and with nobody from William's office included. William went still. The real issue was no longer why the advisor had appeared. Someone was trying to redefine how Harry could reach the king, and who would be excluded when he did. But even Charles could not settle the matter alone, because the next decision depended on who actually controlled access to the monarch, and what rules still mattered when family collided with duty. Royal power often looks absolute from the outside, but inside Windsor, it moves through doors, diaries, private secretaries, security clearances, and carefully controlled access. Harry's advisor had exposed the weakest point in that system. What happens when the king personally wants to see someone whom the heir believes should not be near official business? Suddenly, the issue was larger than William and Charles. It became a battle over where family privilege ended and royal procedure began. Charles knew he had the right to receive almost anyone privately, yet official royal meetings worked differently. Those sessions followed controlled schedules, approved attendance lists, and staff procedures designed to keep personal matters away from institutional business. A private secretary is the senior aide who manages access, schedules, and sensitive communication around a royal figure. That role now sat at the center of the crisis, because the king's own secretary had been asked to protect both personal discretion and official order at the same time. William could not simply overrule his father, and he knew it. But as heir, he carried growing influence over succession planning, family strategy, and decisions that affected the future working structure of the monarchy. The prince therefore pressed one question harder than any other. Who had authorized the advisor's access? The answer came reluctantly. Charles's private secretary admitted that the monarch had personally asked for the arrival to be handled quietly. William's expression tightened. Secrecy was no longer suspected. It had been intentional. The secretary felt the pressure immediately. He had obeyed a direct personal instruction from the king, yet he also understood why the future king believed an undisclosed visitor near formal business created a dangerous precedent. His hands moved carefully through the security record before he finally showed William the entry. The advisor had been cleared for the private office corridor, but not for the meeting room itself. Someone had drawn a deliberate boundary before the prince arrived. Charles seized on that distinction. To him, the record proved Harry's representative had never been intended to enter official discussions. William rejected the comfort of that argument. If the arrangement had to be hidden from everyone attending the meeting, he said, then the boundary had already lost credibility. Trust depended not only on where the advisor stood, but on who knew he would be standing there. The decision came quickly after that. The Windsor meeting would not resume. New access rules would be drafted immediately, separating private family visitors from formal royal sessions more clearly than before. The private secretary lifted the original meeting folder from the table, closed it, and told the waiting aides that the session was cancelled. His hands trembled as he carried it away. By cancelling the meeting, William had forced the palace to choose order over convenience. But the first person to feel the consequence would not be the advisor. It would be Charles himself. The corridor emptied, but the damage did not leave with the aides. Charles remained inside his office after the cancelled meeting, staring at a day that had collapsed because of a decision he had believed might bring his family closer together. William had walked away convinced he had protected a necessary boundary. The king was left with a different feeling, that every road toward Harry now demanded a price from someone else. For the first time, the advisor's visit felt less like an opportunity and more like a warning. Charles sat alone, while staff quietly began dismantling a schedule that had taken weeks to arrange. Several sensitive family discussions and royal working matters now had to be moved because the Windsor session had been cancelled without warning. Temporary instructions followed almost immediately. No unlisted personal representative would be allowed to wait in a restricted office corridor during a formal working session. A restricted corridor is an area where access is controlled because private royal business is being conducted nearby. The new rule sounded procedural, but its meaning was deeply personal. One family dispute had just changed palace practice. The king felt the consequence more sharply than anyone around him understood. He had tried to create one narrow path back toward Harry, hoping private contact might reduce the bitterness surrounding every public exchange. Instead, that effort had widened the distance between himself and William. Charles picked up the telephone, began dialing, then stopped halfway. He set the receiver down and pressed both hands against the desk. For a moment, the monarch looked less like a sovereign managing a crisis and more like a father, realizing that protecting one son had wounded the other. William felt no victory as he left Windsor. During the drive away, he told an aide that he had never wanted Charles to feel cornered or humiliated. But the prince refused to apologize for stopping the meeting. He believed the boundary had to be defended because hidden family negotiations could not be allowed to drift into official royal space. The future king understood the personal cost, yet he also knew silence would have made the next breach easier. Harry's advisor departed carrying the proposal he had intended to discuss. It remained unopened and formally unheard, meaning the request at the center of the crisis was still alive. Before leaving, he sent Harry a short message. Meeting cancelled. William objected. Those 4 words carried the conflict beyond Windsor and stripped away every careful explanation Charles might later offer. The king finally made his decision. If trust with William was going to survive, the next conversation could not involve secretaries, advisors, schedules, or representatives. The next conversation would decide whether father and son could still trust each other, and this time, neither man would have an advisor to hide behind. The turning point did not happen in front of courtiers. There were no briefing papers, advisors, or closed ranks of palace staff. Charles and William met privately, with no institutional buffer between them and no hairy representative waiting beyond the door. That changed everything. For once, they were not arguing about protocol. They were speaking as a father afraid of losing one son, and an heir afraid of losing confidence in the man whose crown he would one day inherit. Charles had asked for the meeting the following evening, and made one condition clear. Both households would keep their aides outside. The king wanted no private secretary translating emotion into procedure, and no staff member turning an unfinished thought into an official position. William agreed, because the prince no longer wanted to argue only about Harry. He wanted to know whether his father still trusted him with sensitive family decisions that could eventually affect the crown. The monarch spoke first. He admitted that the Clarence House contact had been concealed because he believed William would reject the idea before it had any chance to work. The admission came without excuses. Charles acknowledged that fear of conflict had become secrecy, and secrecy had created something worse than the argument he had tried to avoid. He apologized. The words did not erase what had happened, but the future king finally heard something he had been demanding since Windsor: ownership. William answered just as carefully. Seeing Harry's advisor outside the office had triggered more than anger. It had brought back the fear that private Sussex negotiations could again drift toward official royal decision-making without warning. The prince told his father that he could accept difficult choices. What he could not accept was being deliberately kept unaware until those choices were already inside the palace. Charles then reached for the proposal. He slid it across the small table and waited while his son read. Harry was asking for one private meeting with his father, without cameras, public statements, or immediate palace involvement. Nothing in the request demanded a return to royal duties. Nothing asked William to participate. It was, at its core, a son asking to speak privately to his father. The prince finished reading and pushed the proposal back. "See him as your son," he said. "Just don't make the institution guess what happens next." Charles visibly softened. William had not blocked the meeting. Instead, he had drawn a boundary. Private contact could remain private, but it could never again be hidden inside official royal schedules. Father and son finally had something they had lacked at Windsor: an agreement. Inside the family, a boundary had finally been drawn. But outside Windsor, the cancelled meeting was already becoming something far larger. By morning, the private corridor dispute had escaped the castle walls. The public did not know every word exchanged between Charles and William, but one fact was impossible to ignore. A Windsor meeting had been halted after Harry's advisor appeared near the king's private office. What had begun as a family disagreement now became a national spectacle about royal access, loyalty, and whether the brothers' fractured relationship was once again reaching into the machinery of the monarchy. Palace staff moved quickly to contain the damage. A tightly worded explanation said the meeting had been postponed because of a scheduling and attendance issue, carefully avoiding any direct mention of Harry. The statement was meant to calm the situation, but it did the opposite. Commentators immediately focused on William's decision to stop the session, arguing that access to official royal business was now being guarded more aggressively than before. For the public, the issue was no longer one advisor in one corridor. It was about who could reach the crown, and under what conditions. Charles hated what followed. He had tried to preserve one private path toward his younger son, yet the attempt was now being framed as a struggle between monarch and heir. The king felt the distortion deeply because the arrangement had never been meant to weaken William. Harry reacted with equal frustration when the coverage reached him. He saw his indirect attempt to reach his father turned into another symbol of exclusion, proof that even silence around the family could become a public battle. The story exploded when a major London newspaper appeared with the front-page words, "Windsor meeting stopped," above a split image of William arriving at the castle and Harry at an earlier royal event. Television broadcasters repeated one question throughout the morning. Why was the advisor there? Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered behind the barriers as live reports continued. One placard carried only 3 words: family or firm. It captured the argument more sharply than hours of commentary. William watched one television report in silence. The prince let it run for less than a minute before switching it off and telling his aide to continue with the day's engagements. He would not attack Harry. He would not criticize Charles. That restraint mattered because public silence prevented the private settlement from collapsing under fresh accusations. The palace then quietly confirmed that new internal access procedures had taken effect. The confrontation had produced a real operational change. Yet Charles still refused to abandon the possibility of meeting Harry privately. The headlines made the confrontation look like a victory or defeat. Inside the family, however, the final meaning of Windsor was far more complicated and far more permanent. In the end, William's decision to halt the Windsor meeting did not permanently shut Harry out, and it did not strip Charles of the right to see his younger son. What it did was force the royal family to confront a boundary they had avoided defining for years. Family contact could still exist. Reconciliation could still be attempted. But private relationships and official royal business could no longer be allowed to blur together in secrecy, without damaging trust between the people closest to the crown. Charles accepted the new rule because he finally understood what the Windsor confrontation had exposed. Any future contact involving Harry or his representatives would have to remain clearly separate from formal working sessions whenever William or shared royal business was involved. A formal working session is an official meeting where royal responsibilities, schedules, and institutional decisions are discussed. That distinction now mattered more than ever. The king could still act as a father, but the monarchy could no longer be left guessing where family ended and duty began. William accepted his own limit as well. The prince understood that protecting the institution did not give him the right to control every private decision his father made. If Charles wanted to meet Harry away from official business, he would not stand in the way. The future king's responsibility was not to close every family door. It was to make certain that personal relationships never again entered royal decision-making through secrecy. The king carried the hardest lesson quietly. While trying to preserve contact with one son, he had almost damaged the trust of the son standing beside him. Charles realized that secrecy had not protected anyone. William reached an equally painful conclusion. His anger had been justified, but control could not become its own danger. Neither man had won. Both had been forced to change. The Windsor meeting therefore became a dividing line inside the household. Private Sussex contact would be separated from official scheduling and controlled royal access. Harry's advisor had not truly caused the crisis. His presence had exposed a deeper weakness that years of family fracture had left unresolved. Nobody had agreed on where private reconciliation stopped and institutional responsibility began. Days later, Charles and William entered another private meeting together. This time, the attendance list had been agreed in advance. Before sitting down, the king looked toward his son and said quietly, "No surprises." William answered, "That's all I asked." Nothing was magically repaired, but neither man walked away. William had stopped one meeting because a hidden arrangement crossed a line. What followed finally defined that line. Charles remained free to be Harry's father. William remained responsible for protecting the future institution, and the monarchy emerged with a rule it had desperately lacked. Family doors could remain open, but official ones would no longer open in secret. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.